We've all had mountaintop experiences, haven't we? We look back on them with great fondness and affection. Not many, but just a number to make them very, very special in our lives. Let me just share one of them with you. I was a young minister in my first parish. I'd studied at 3 universities. I'd studied theology and philosophy and business management and ethics and everything you could possibly imagine. And I came out onto my first job as a probation minister in the Methodist Church of the United Kingdom. And I was pretty full of myself. I was pretty smart. And I was sent to a church that was a tiny little church in a really, really rough part of town with a small congregation. And I delivered my first sermon on that day, which was brilliant, let me tell you. Do you know the first sermon that a minister delivers after all that training, the first sermon is the easiest sermon you could ever preach. You've had 6 years to write it. The one a week after, you've only got 5 days. So I delivered this sermon and I was pretty proud of myself. And as I was shaking hands with the small group of people who were coming out of the church on that day, Mrs. McGregor came up to me, and Mrs. McGregor was a tiny little woman. And she'd had a pretty rough life over the years. I remember she always used to come to church in her carpet slippers. They were like tartan with bubbles on. And she said to me, this little lady in this rough part of town, she said, "Minister," she said, "do you think you could just come up and have a word with me during the week?" I thought, "Oh, yes, of course." And so, in the middle of the week, I made way to her pretty run-down place in a rough part of town. Lots of the houses had been burnt out, semi-derelict. I made my way up the stone staircase into this tiny little house that was very, very frugally furnished, thinking to myself, I've got a pretty lot to offer this lady. And she said to me, "Minister," she said, "I wanted a word with you. I thought your interpretation of Nietzsche was inaccurate." My scales fell off my eyes, and I learned very, very quickly in that light-revealing moment that to regard and to respect every living person, irrespective of their apparent status, education, ability, sexuality, or social position. This lady, I didn't know. She'd had a real rough life, but she actually read. She went to the library and she got out all this stuff and she read it, and she could blow me to bits, let me tell you. And she did, God bless her, and I'm glad she did. And this particular moment was a liberating moment for me, because those moments, they break down all false barriers, and they bring feelings that say to you, there are no limits here. And this, I believe, is the one strong message that comes through this strange story that we read in our lesson today, as it's Transfiguration Sunday. Now, when you read that, you think to yourself, well, what does all that mean? Well, like much of the New Testament, you can't understand it without looking at it through the eyes of the Old Testament. And that's why we read from the book of Exodus that preceded the gospel reading today. Now, much of what we read about Jesus in the New Testament is written in typically Jewish style. And we've got to remind ourselves of this all the time, that the early Christians were all Jews. They were faithful Jews. They were elders and rabbis and Pharisees. The great preacher and traveler and missionary in the New Testament, Paul, he, in writing to the church in Philippi, this is how he describes himself. He says, "Circumcised, the stock of Israel. I am of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee with zeal." So now, in reading the stories of Jesus as we do, we must acknowledge that the writers of those stories, which we read 2,000 years on, they were using the rabbinic Jewish style of storytelling. And this style of storytelling is known, the Hebrew word that is used is known as midrash. It was first identified by a leading biblical scholar, Professor Michael Golder in the UK. And what he describes to us is something which really enables the scales to fall off your eyes when you're reading this stuff. Because, you see, what this midrash is, it says that it's the regular rabbinic practice of recording something new, yes, but only doing so through the old images and stories of the past. Because by so doing, it gives greater status to what's being written, and, of course, it would be fully understood by the Jewish Christians of the day. And this rabbinic style of storytelling, they would filter the stories of the present through memories of the past, as was written down in the holy writings, predominantly what we now call the Old Testament. So, Jesus going up into a high mountain with some very special close friends, I'm sure he did that, and experiencing a supernatural experience resembled something very close to what Moses experienced and what he did in the book of Exodus. And the writers built into that the revered figures of Jewish history. Those revered figures who had been collected and recorded through mythology and folklore for centuries and centuries, including Moses and Elijah, who went up into heaven in a fiery chariot. That's how Moses went to heaven, and that's how Elijah went to heaven. And Moses similarly went to heaven in a different way. They didn't just die according to these stories in the normal way. And what it was to do was to link Jesus to that miraculous concept of conquering death. So, as with Moses, there was a mountain that Jesus ascended. He was accompanied by three of his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, as Moses was, with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. And with both of them, there were bright clouds which overshadowed them. And the Lord spoke from heaven, both to Moses and to his mates, and to Jesus and his. And also, as with Moses, when they returned, their faces shone, and their clothes, that's where I'm wearing white today, their clothes were bright as light, just as on that original Mount Sinai. So all of a sudden, what we read in the story in Matthew that just sounded a bit strange, all of a sudden, well, we can understand it a bit now. Throughout the whole of Jewish history, light and fire have been important symbols. So the idea that the light of God had come to Jesus was just a natural continuation of that Jewish tradition. And the light would shine on him, just like it shone on Moses. This was not a literal story about a literal moment in Jesus' life. It was never meant to be taken literally. And the people for whom it was written and who wrote it 2,000 years ago, the Jewish people, remember that, it was a well-known method of rabbinic storytelling, conveying a message and meaning and demonstrating it through a range of symbols of the past. Now, because it's not literal, do we just dismiss it and say, well, it doesn't mean anything then? Well, it has. It's got some really powerful messages for us. And let's just look at those. First, the first message is this. It's a message of uplift, of inspiration and encouragement. Matthew's gospel was probably compiled about AD 90. And it would have been compiled again by those Jewish rabbis who, at the time, were trying to make sense of a world for them which was full of chaos and destruction. The temple in Jerusalem, which was central to the faith of the Jews, had been destroyed completely. They saw the whole of Judaism crumbling around them. It was a world of horror. And so what those writers wanted to do was to say that all that had been foretold in the Old Testament, and like other Old Testament characters, Jesus and his followers, and we count ourselves in that number, would overcome adversity and death and pain and suffering, just like had happened in the Old Testament. And so this story draws from the Old Testament something very, very special, because it says that even though at the time of writing the Jewish people were facing horror with the destruction of their temple, nevertheless, glorious light can shine. Jesus' face shone. All Jews would recall the words in Esdras, in the promise to the righteous, when he says, all their faces shall shine like the sun. That gives to us and to them encouragement. That's the first message. Secondly, there is the message of recognizing the importance of stillness. Remember Peter's reaction. Come on, Jesus, I know what we'll do. We'll build 3 tabernacles. We'll build these tents, and we'll have one for you, Jesus, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Oh, it'll be great. Come on, let's get on with it. Let's do something. This was Peter, the man of action. He wanted to do stuff. Get on with it. But Jesus cautions him. You know, we've all been there. We've all been to that place with a need to do something, to be seen to be doing something. But Jesus said, there's a time for stillness here. There's a time for contemplation, for wonder, and for reverence. Psalm 46, remember, be still, and know that I am God. Sometimes we are just too busy trying to do something when we'd be much better just being silent, to be listening. And when we do that, that prepares us properly for informed decisions and consequent actions. You might have heard me said, some of you, when I'm talking about my wife, I describe her as worshipping at the high altar of the equestrian god. She's a great horse person. We've got 3 horses. I'm number 4 on the list. I know my place. Right. And I will talk about that many times in the future, but I'm pushing that aside for the moment. I'll wait to do that when she's here. Next week will be one of those days because there's no equestrian event. But apart from the high altar of the equestrian god, she's got another god. It's called the Great IKEA God. And many a time I have got home and there sitting in front of me are a pile of cardboard flat packs and an Allen key. You've been there, I know. And it's my job to make some sense of these things. And what I do is I rip the boxes open, I throw away the instructions, and I just get on with it. Me and my faithful Allen key. I charge ahead, and many, many times I have to take the half-built construction to pieces again because I hadn't thought about the sequence, which of course I would have done if I'd read the instructions. I'm just impatient, and I get on with it. It's important. It is important, just on occasions, to step back and consider and read the instructions. And the third message that comes out of this story, despite what I've just said, it sounds a bit contradictory, but it isn't. The third message is that after Peter had intended to build those holy places, he then wanted to stay there in that holy moment. He wished it to be prolonged. He didn't want to go down to the everyday, normal, nitty-gritty of life. He wanted forever to remain in the sheen of that glorious moment. And this is a feeling we know. There are moments of intimacy, of serenity, of peace. There are spiritual moments. We wish to prolong them, don't we? But as A.H. McNeill says, the mountain of transfiguration is always more enjoyable than the daily grind. It's a strong message to the church which finds it easy to stay in the cloistered confines of religious secrecy and isolation. I am reminded of the prayer of Susanna Wesley, John Wesley's mum. It's amazing, she had time for prayer, really. She had 19 children, but her prayer, help me, Lord, to remember that religion is not to be confined to the church or the closet, nor exercised only in prayer and meditation, but everywhere. The moment of glory does not exist for its own sake. It exists to clothe the common things with a radiance that they never had before. Now, sometimes that light that we talk about, the wonderful light of glory, sometimes It's instant. It's a light-filled moment. It's an instant realization, or alternatively, sometimes it just creeps up on you. Every morning I take my dog Oscar, and I will be introducing Oscar to you over the next few weeks, let me tell you. Every single morning I take my dog Oscar for a walk. And because at the moment I'm living up in the hills and it's quite a drive in the morning, it means that I have to have a very early morning walk, and it's dark. And so Oscar and I go out with the torch for the beginning of our walk, and about halfway through that walk, the lightness just creeps up on us. You've seen it yourself. It just creeps up on you slowly, and at first you don't notice it. And then it's daylight. And that's what happens quite often for some of those special feelings that we've had, that not necessarily instant. They can be a slowly moving moment in our lives. But when it is instant, it's mind-blowing. And I've had some of those. One of those mountaintop, light-filled moments for me was my ordination when I was ordained as a minister into the church, and I was given this Bible, my ordination Bible, and I remember that moment still to this day as a terrific moment of transfiguration. I remember my wedding and the birth of my children and the meeting with Mrs. MacDonald. They're all really important moments in my life, and you have the same. There was for a moment, a few years back, when I was the CEO of an organization and I'd felt a little bit detached from the church because I was working outside the church, and I offered myself to go back to do Sundays in a group of churches. And one of the churches that I became minister of just for a relatively short period of time was in a place called Boho South. Now, if you go home and you look at a map for Boho, you'll find that actually there's nothing there. It's just paddocks. It's one of those places, and we have a lot of these, that is just an area. And Boho South, therefore, is south of nothing. And in south of nothing, they had this weatherboard church that a farmer had put there years previous, and a handful of people went there on Sundays to have a morning service, and I found myself as a minister of that church, along with other churches, conducting their services. It was a church in which there was no electricity, and you can imagine what it was like in north-central Victoria in the middle of the winter. It was damn cold, let me tell you, really. And so, as I was working with that church, trying to work out what its ministry might be, I mean, how can you possibly have a ministry where there isn't anything? And then I thought, yes, I know what we'll do. We will use that as the USP, the unique selling point. What we will do with this church is, because it's in the middle of nowhere, that's its biggest advantage. In other words, you can make one heck of a noise and row, and you've got nobody to complain about it. And that's what we did, you see. And we made it. We made it into a center for practice and performances of heavy rock bands. Which was wonderful. But I must tell you about the opening event, because we opened the event just when, as I said, those moments when it's just beginning to get dark. And people came from far and wide, and the church was full. And we didn't have the lights on. We deliberately left it with no power and no electricity. And in the course of the service, it got darker and darker and darker, just waiting for the moment when we flicked the lights on. And I had huge number of spotlights all lined up around the church, and I'd had a huge number of loudspeakers. And at a certain moment, I pressed the button, and all the lights came on, and this heavy rock music, it was The Who, Let's See Action. And the whole place just shook, and everybody was amazed with this incredible moment. It's fantastic. Really, it's what as I talk about it now, I get still excited about it. And then it calmed down a bit, and there was a knock on the back door of the church. And in came this farmer. And he said, I won't tell you his precise language, but I think you can get the gist. He said, "What the heck's going on here? You're disturbing my alpacas." I will never forget that moment. As it happened, that was an introduction of the church to the alpaca farmer, who eventually joined the church. I said to him, "Look, we'll keep the music a bit low," and he joined the church, and he's still a member of that church after all these years. And so light illuminates our life, is uplifting and inspirational. We've reached the mountaintop. But yet, there might be another mountain to climb. The journey which sometimes is not filled with light, during which there might be stumbling or help required. But it's still worth doing as we press on to the glorious future. But sometimes that wonderful euphoria evaporates. You find yourself not at the top, but right at the bottom of the valley. A wonderful light-filled wedding day contrasted with the darkness of a divorce court. A parent's multi-candled lit birthday cake set alongside the coldness of a crematorium with only a faded photo to hold on to. Standing on the gold medal podium of an Olympic platform like Grant Hackett. Or because of an inability to cope with being ordinary again, staring into the misery of a drug rehabilitation unit or prison cell. And time again, we hear of people who slip from the peak. Ben Cousins, Marilyn Monroe, Maria Carey, George Best, Kate Moss, the names go on. We know them all, these celebrities, who have been right at the very top, but who crash. But even closer than those people, we know people ourselves who fall, whose lives are full of stress, who are under severe pressure. And they're all around us, even now. Remember the words of Martin Luther King Jr.? Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. He says, I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted and every mountain shall be laid low. And I'm not worried, he says, because I've been to the mountaintop. And that is why all of those of us who know the top and the bottom, we know it so well, we have the task of the Himalayan Sherpas to help others to get back onto that mountain. And I appeal this morning to every one of you to reach out to people who've fallen a bit, who find themselves like the psalmist in the valley of the shadow of death, who are suffering pain and isolation and lovelessness. You know, in Australia, we're so good, aren't we, unthinkingly at saying to people, "G'day, how are you doing?" And then we get back the standard answer, don't we? "Oh, good." But many, many a time, that single word uttered automatically can just be a cover for something that hides real suffering. In all our relationships and friendships and colleagueships, we should go beyond the superficial. Help carry that backpack. Help with the climb. Provide oxygen for those with a difficult climb. And then we break through the clouds and we scale the peak together. Wow. And how much brighter it will be if we can see each other's face shining. Where there is darkness, may you bring light. Where there is coldness, may you bring warmth. Where there is sadness, may you bring joy. Where there is anger, may you bring peace. And where there is discord, may you bring healing. Let God's light shine on you and from you.